It's really wonderful to see all of you here and to thank our wonderful speakers that we've just had, and I'll try and acknowledge them appropriately shortly. My life as a Collingwood Tragic began in 1977, a year in which my young mind became confused by the concept of a drawn grand final, followed by a devastating defeat. It was the moment that the terrible realisation dawned on me that the utopian fantasy world I'd created in that small East Burwood backyard, the one in which Collingwood always won the grand final every night, just in time for dinner, was a world about as real as Star Wars or Dungeons and Dragons. The real world was a place far more brutal, horrible and uncertain. A place where historic buildings were torn down to make way for ugly brown boxes. Oil prices were controlled by crazed ayatollahs. The Russians and Americans were stockpiling mountains of thermonuclear bombs. Nana Mouskouri and Engelbert Humperdinck were allowed to make records virtually unchecked. And Carlton won grand finals. As Kurt says in Heart of Darkness, the horror, the horror. It also began to slowly dawn on me that I was not alone as a Collingwood Tragic, that many others shared my burden, destined to carry the weight of it through life. In time I would share my stories with them. But what is a Collingwood Tragic? Is it a person without teeth and a badly considered haircut? Or someone of modest intelligence with a simple love of Bon Jovi, Kiss and Motley Crue? Is it a person who continues to believe that having a yellowing yakka top with a peeling Stand 3 Magro on the back is a cutting-edge fashion statement? And that when it comes to tattoos, less is never more? And that maybe this weekend I'll do my other arm as well? Or is it just many average folk like us here tonight? My inner tragic has always emerged whenever Collingwood are locked in a life and death struggle. It was evident during September 1979 when I found myself unable to watch the grand final and retreated to the sanctuary of my grandmother's house, where I found myself sitting paralysed on the floor, agonising over the game but unable to watch it, somewhat like a trapped animal or jabbering mental patient. As the game wound to its epic, ill-fated and horrible conclusion, following the harm's boundary line tap from somewhere deep amidst the traffic on Brunton Avenue, I awaited like a boy on death row as my grandfather entered to pronounce my terrible sentence. The worst 4 words ever uttered. Not war has been declared, but Carlton by 5 points. As in Carlton have won by 5 points. My reaction to this, possibly the worst moment of my life, is described on page 83. I won't labour through it now, but suffice to say that it ends with me staggering home, collapsing into my mother's arms and bawling my eyes out. Which is kind of a story that repeats itself in the years to follow. I'm glad to say, however, that I eventually stopped bawling my eyes out to my mother at about the age of 34. Years later, during the unbearably tense last quarter of the 1990 drawn qualifying final against West Coast, after Dacos' famous worm-burning checkside goal offered Collingwood a fragile but precious time on lead, my mother entered the family's outdoor shed to find the radio on with Crackers Keenan going into hyper-insane hysterics, screaming mindlessly into the microphone for a sustained and possibly world record 24 seconds. And there I was, lying on the shed floor, seemingly dead, in what she would later describe as the fetal position. During my uni days, while boarding at Don Bosco Boys Hostel, Brunswick from 1989 to 91, I quickly gained a reputation as the most short-fused, uptight and baitable Collingwood supporter on the block. Oftentimes, as I struggled home in a foul mood from the freezing cold journey to and from Waverley, following another ignominious defeat, fellow residents would form a makeshift choir outside my bedroom door to sing the club song of the team that had just beaten us. As though singing some joyous Christmas carol. I would always spitefully pretend not to be in my room and wait it out, sometimes for half an hour or more, until they gave up and left, not wanting to give them the satisfaction. When Gavin Brown was knocked out at quarter time in the grand final that year, I could be seen pirouetting in a fit of agonised screaming, somewhat like Frank, the ill-fated courier in the closing scenes of Gallipoli, smashing my fist into the dining room table about 17 times and running outside, where I began screaming at clouds. If a recent email from an old mate, who's, I'm glad to say, is here tonight, is anything to go by, it seems that even after achieving the long-awaited premiership in 1990, I remained a rather intense fellow. A former resident of Don Bosco Boys Hostel recently wrote, "You certainly are an avid Magpie fan, quite possibly the most passionate fan I have ever known. I can remember one time in the early 90s when we were living at Donny Bosco's and Richmond had upset the Pies and won one out of the blue. It was a Sunday night and I had just returned from Currumborough. I remember catching up with you that night and saying, 'Hey Jimmy, go Tigers!' Your prompt reply was, 'Get.' And the look you gave me was bloody scary, and I thought that you were going to kill me. A lesson learned from a young cocky boy from Gippsland. Sorry, Mum." During the live telecast of the 2010 preliminary final against Geelong, I encouraged my wife to leave the TV off and read a book while I nervously paced the back streets of Fairfield in the dark, silently praying and staring in at unknown people's windows to pick up fragmentary progress scores from the televisions of strangers, like some creepy and disturbed peeping Tom. And in the heat of the 2010 drawn grand final, I fled our hotel in Byron Bay and sat by the river like a tormented golem-like creature in the midst of a football-induced nervous breakdown, so that even a grizzled, aged hippie riding past on his bike shook his head at me as though I was the saddest-looking specimen he'd ever seen. I'm not sure how a psychologist would evaluate all of this, but I'm pretty sure it's not what you'd call normal, healthy behaviour. Not all Collingwood Tragics, however, are as pathetic as me. They assume other forms, some of which I will now try to explain. Some Collingwood Tragics are petty, mean-spirited and small-minded. They have long memories and don't care what you think. They remember the John Greening incident, the boundary line incident, the Kerry Good incident, the Russell Olsen incident, the Gavin Brown incident. They know for a fact that we haven't been given a fair go from the umpires since 1910. And the only reason we ever lose is because of blatant, bloody-minded crucifixion. A Collingwood Tragic hopes that every year Collingwood will be in the top 4, and the bottom half of the ladder will read 11th Hawthorn, 12th Brisbane, 13th Richmond, 14th Melbourne, 15th Essendon, and 16th Carlton. They also pray every single night that Carlton will not win another flag until the year 2111, and even that might just be a little too soon. The Collingwood Tragic is generous and broad-minded with a sense of humour, like Eddie, who donated the Collingwood Gate for years to the Battlers, Melbourne and the Bulldogs, and Joffa, who rattled the can for Carlton when it looked as if the Blues were becoming bankrupt. The Collingwood Tragic is my poor, long-suffering mother who declared the 1958 grand final the greatest moment of her life, and has since seen Collingwood draw 2 grand finals and lose 8, most of which were nail-biting, heart-stopping catastrophes. Collingwood Tragic is my brother Jeff, who in 2002 was receiving silent text messages from the MCG with score updates on the Collingwood Adelaide preliminary final while standing at the altar for his brother's exchange of vows.
That's good.
Collingwood Tragic is the man in the gold jacket who is loved and loathed in equal measure and is there behind the goals every week, rain, hail or shine, win, lose or draw. Collingwood Tragic is my mate Matt O'Connor, who refers to anyone who doesn't barrack for the Pies as a member of the NCFW, non-Collingwood football world, and was photographed dancing on the bar of the Rose Hotel following the grand final rematch in a scene reminiscent of the VE Day celebrations following World War II. A Collingwood Tragic is my mate Bill Demetriadis, who sits in the MCC each week and at the end of every quarter of every game storms out through the chaos of the newsstand to the outside smokers circle, where he produces from a gold cigarette case one of his special grade cigarettes that could fell a buffalo and kill several normal civilians. Sucks it down in less time than it takes to say, that fucking Tubi's got to learn how to kick. Before storming back to his seat, where from another case he produces a set of Greek worry beads, which he then proceeds to file through nervously for the next 25 minutes, before repeating the whole process all over again for the next 3 quarters.